everyone. Welcome to Ghost Trends 2020, Making Sense of an Elusive World with Tim Stock here at KODW this year. It doesn't feel like it, but we're moving at breakneck speed towards wrapping up to the end of the year. How many of you in our audience today have experienced change like never before? I sure have, in every aspect of our lives, as it's turned upside down with the realization of COVID-19 being here to stay and forcing us to think seriously about the future of our new normal and the sustainability of it. I'm your host today, Jaclyn, a managing partner of Altitude Labs, a digital transformation consulting firm here in Asia. I'm a software engineer by training, but have been in the business for about 8 or so years now, but I now work in the depths of user experience design and product architecture with my clients. What makes it so fun is that I get to learn about their problems and their businesses, different businesses, all the time. So I would like to introduce our esteemed speaker today, Tim Stock, co-founder of Scenario DNA, a consultancy that leverages the union of consumer anthropology and data science to advise global clients on upcoming trends and system thinking approach to innovation. He's also a co-inventor of a patented methodology called culture mapping, which is an analysis of patterns using machine learning to visualize trends and forecasts. An overview of what's going to happen this session, Tim will be giving his presentation to us about trends in socioeconomics, healthcare, psychology, food, and our world today, followed by a lovely dialogue between the two of us, and finally ending with a live Q&A session. If you have any questions during or after the presentation, please feel free to share that with us in the dialogue box. Hi, Tim. How are you today?
Hi. Doing great. Hello from New York.
We're in this fast-changing world today, and we're really excited to hear from you about ghost trends. Could you give us a little synopsis of what you're about to say in our presentation today?
Yes, I think it's we're all facing a crisis, and it's almost sort of, it creates kind of a moment where we're frozen, but it's a great point for everybody to be much more contemplative on the work we were doing before this crisis hit, and what the purpose of our design will be going forward. It's a really great opportunity to redirect what we do as designers, but we need to have sort of much more bravery in terms of how we use our design through this, and not just simply repeat bad habits that we had begun before. So those are the ghosts that we need to sort of listen to and to direct us towards a better potential future.
Sure, we're really excited to hear you speak. So on to your presentation.
Great.
Hello, my name is Tim Stock, and I'm a trend forecaster. We've been looking at the trends around COVID-19. Those trends relate to a theme of ghosts, which is all about uncontrollable change that has caught us off guard. But the key to looking at COVID-19 is not what's happening now, but how it puts a spotlight on the designs that we had before and how we might be able to redirect those designs towards better use. When we think about the way to do that, we have to get under the surface, and we use a method called culture mapping to look at the language to understand how are people responding to change. What were they thinking before, and how are they sort of responding in the context of something like a pandemic like COVID-19? We have to look at that constant change to be able to understand how to best redirect our efforts. We have to think less like marketers. We have to think less in the near term, which is really one of the challenges, and think much more about the long-term consequences of what we're building. And that's really the key to how to build sustainable design systems going forward. So looking at the way in which language changes is a wonderful tool to be able to see these kinds of changes in action. So when we start looking at some of these trends, some certain themes have sort of come to light. And one of them is how we've been planning our cities, the economics, the ghost economics was there before COVID-19. How we were planning our cities was about scale. It was about growth. We've seen an economic expansion over the last 10 years that has fueled an urbanization globally. But what is interesting within that globalization is it's not even, and it doesn't really represent a sustainability that is really going to be good for us long term. And I think COVID really has brought a lot of that to light. Some of the words that come to light, this is some language that was there prior to COVID. One was the concept of urban density, and the other are ghost apartments. Ghost apartments is a term that is used for a property that is used as investment, and they sit empty within these cities. And so what happens before COVID, it looks as though it's all about growth and expansion. Post-COVID, what we have is a lot of empty apartments, and we have entire developments that are now sitting empty. We look at the growth of Airbnb, for example. We have a trend within ghost hotels. So all of that inventory, suddenly with a pandemic, all of this inventory is sitting empty. And so there's a shadow economy that we've developed, that we've actually built with a lot of this scale and growth. And the same with these ghost apartments. Those ghost apartments now literally sit empty, and we wonder if they'll ever be filled again. So the economics of how we've sort of looked at design and sort of that marketing idea of design is now sort of coming much more into focus, and we've put a spotlight on that. Another aspect of it is in terms of what kind of jobs. Urbanization drew a lot in terms of what we call the gig economy. Well, the gig economy is also a ghost economy. It's a lot of incremental sort of purchasing of labor. And COVID now sort of places an extra emphasis on how that actually works and doesn't work. We have a lot of kinds of people working, but towards what end, and the issue of what protections there are for that particular labor force. So a lot of the kinds of trends that have emerged over the last several years are certainly gig labor force, but even in terms of we have ghost writers for the rise in influencers. I don't know if anybody is aware of the fact that with all of the influencers that drive our sort of desire for things, there are people who are actually writing for those people as well. Have you ever wondered what is driving the intelligence behind your Alexa? Well, it's a ghost labor force sort of programming that intelligence around how well that works. There's a ghost economy that we've developed, and COVID really puts it into focus. The other is in terms of ghost worlds. And one of the keys is we built through technology a virtuality to the way in which we live our lives. And there's been sort of a positive and optimistic side to that, but it has also this very sort of this dark side that has been looming prior to COVID. COVID has really brought a lot of that into light. Well, let's look at that from the standpoint of language. And you see two concepts really sort of playing against each other. One is virtual reality, our drive towards technology of virtual experiences. The other is loneliness. There's actually been a huge increase in loneliness. There's a minister of loneliness within the UK. Loneliness by the World Health Organization has been determined to be the #1 cause of disease globally. It's something that is actually at the scale of a pandemic prior to COVID. And when you look at what COVID does to sort of making us be much more aware of that idea of what impact that loneliness has on our health. So a lot of these experiences that we're having now are sort of driven by that virtuality and make us confront much more that kind of sense of being alone and being disconnected. We ghost people. There's been a trend in how we ghost other people we know. We have military being trained to have virtually sort of run wars. And the impact that has on our health, our mental health, is now something that we must much more consider as designers. That impact is really something that is far more abstract and has a huge sort of ramification towards our long-term health of our society. And so, like, moving to health, you know, COVID moved our health over to a virtual space. Nobody can see a doctor during a pandemic. So telehealth is something that has risen. So what does that mean in terms of how we see what is healthy in our society and how we view our own personal health? Well, certainly the concept of virtuality drives a greater responsibility towards our personal management of our own health. So applications that are driven around that are certainly on the rise. The question is, what are we measuring? How are we using that data? Well, we're seeing some of that play out during COVID in how we track the pandemic via smart thermometers. And we look at how we sort of are able to upload information about the virus so we can sort of see how it's spreading. There are even groups of people who are working together to be able to use their own genetics towards particular antibody resilience to the virus. And so we see a lot of kinds of sort of moving of health towards personal responsibility and network responsibility. But the question is that we have to understand that there are really abstract consequences to how that plays out for long-term health. The other is in terms of ghost food systems and like how we look at, you know, what we see as food and how we use food. Our kitchens have become far more networked during our urban life. I mean, so many of our kitchens in our homes now look a lot like the kitchens within restaurants because we eat out and we go home and cook and so forth. And there's been this rise of desire for a higher level of food. And a lot of innovation has really been driven around that. The concept of ghost kitchens, which is a term used for scaling high, a high level of cuisine and being able to adapt that cuisine very quickly has been something that had been emerging prior to COVID. There's also it's also tying very much to our desire to be much more engaged with our food than we ever have been before. So there's really kind of an interest around food, but COVID kind of sort of totally throws that off in a lot of ways because we can't go out and eat anymore. And where do we get our access to our food? It throws a lot of that. Many restaurants are going out of business. So you see some of those trends adapting. For example, restaurants that are struggling to stay in business, every kitchen becomes a ghost kitchen now. So you see like networks of kitchens within urban centers now working together to be able to sort of turn every kitchen into that kind of a ghost kitchen, to be able to keep those restaurants in business. We have to think of the concept of a kitchen as being something that is highly adaptable, and it is a center of innovation. It's a center of constant creativity. And so it's not just about scaling. I think that's the unique difference between how we saw food before COVID to now post-COVID is it's not about scale. A ghost kitchen would be about scale. And now in the midst of a pandemic, we see much more about the idea of staying very, very adaptable. So looking at the adaptability of our food systems is very, very critical. We see the rise of humanless spaces prior to COVID. This is Amazon Go, which has been actually cashierless kinds of retail that has been really selling this technology to a lot of other kinds of retailers like 7-Eleven. This is about, prior to COVID, is about efficiency. I can go shop. I don't need to sort of go through any process. It's easier to shop. But what does COVID do to that idea of a humanless experience? It's like when we think of not interacting with people during a pandemic, that becomes something that is, I guess we sort of look at as being healthier and sort of being easier. You know, it's actually something that we would trust more. But we have to sort of look at this kind of removing of people from design with some good skepticism, because the question is when we remove something in the design, it is something within human beings to want it to be replaced with something. So it's not good enough to just remove people. It's how we redirect the human qualities of design into other places. You see a lot of this in a lot of trends that had been emerging. For example, we have toilets in our homes now that we can talk to. Those toilets are probably gathering health information that you're going to share with your doctor. And we have, certainly our grocery stores that are being able to sort of predict what we want. We're able to sort of go in frictionlessly without talking with anybody because they know exactly what we want. The question is what kind of intelligence are we actually building into those experiences? It's not good enough to make them efficient. It's not good enough to make them frictionless. It's about redirecting that kind of intelligence towards a higher level of human quality within these experiences. I think COVID gives us that sense of longing, of that loss of something that's happened during the process. And I think that it's something that is going to be a real challenge for designers. The other, in terms of these trends, is around manufacture and manufacturing. And COVID really has placed a huge emphasis. I mean, the category of fashion and fast fashion is about taking something people like and scaling it to a mass degree. We now, with COVID, suddenly are faced with, how do I turn my factories to move to make masks? I don't need dresses and jeans. I need masks. I need something particular for a particular purpose. So when we think about how we look at operations and manufacture, we have to look at a far more sort of protean, adaptable kind of manufacture going forward. A lot of the ways, and you sort of look at the language around that, it would be, looking at materials differently. How we're using these materials, and material technology. So the kinds of materials that are much more adaptable to that kind of manufacture, as well as responsible manufacturing. I mean, and the issue of responsibility in that manufacture, because it looks at sort of what kinds of other effects come from what we make. If we just scale things, is there a negative consequence to that scale that we haven't really thought of? So many manufacturers really and companies have been sort of put to task during COVID-19 in this way. And you look at, distilleries and breweries making hand sanitizers, and you look at fashion companies making masks and so forth. But really, what is the bigger theme post-COVID? It's that there's going to be a relocalization within manufacturing. That's going to be the rise of micro factories within local urban centers that are much closer to demand. And so how we look at kind of these adaptable kind of on-demand manufacturing frameworks is really kind of the key to how we think of going forward. It's not simply about producing something somewhere and then shipping it and selling it and spending a lot of time on marketing. We have to think much more of closing the loop on the value chain, on the supply chain, and being much more responsible in how we look at manufacturing going forward. At the root of that really is looking at the kind of what are the underlying indicators? What are the consequences? When we think of anything we make, we are pulling from the earth. We look at, one of the most abstract sort of concepts within design that's so hard to get people to understand is climate change and sustainability. It's probably the most misunderstood and misused because it's not because people don't want to, it's very hard to sort of get our hands around it. Well, COVID puts sustainability and climate change much more into clear focus because really it's a product of that. If you look at, so the product of COVID is zoonotic spillage. It has a lot to do with sort of pulling resources, and what the consequences of pulling those resources is. Are we paying attention when we do that? I mean, a lot of what we do in terms of design is to do these things and then make those mistakes and then have to afterwards sort of go through this process of correcting them. The idea of recycling and the idea of sort of, taking waste and reusing it and so forth. It's like, when we look into the future, we can't be a reuse culture. We have to start from the beginning of using things in a way so we don't have to make up for those kind of mistakes. And that comes down to really tracking things and seeing things early. Again, it goes to the root of looking at design more like an epidemiologist, as somebody studying viruses, much like those that are looking at COVID. And so when we think about things like, the rising sea levels and, what's the consequences of there's ghost nets out in our oceans from the overfishing and so forth. There are a lot of these kind of factors that we need to be paying attention to much earlier. And they have a huge role in how we look at the sustainability of our design and how we sort of think more creatively of solving these kinds of problems. I think one of the things that we have to sort of be most aware of is that, COVID hits us and it's not happening to us. It's making us aware of things we've already been doing. So in a sense, we have to think much more as not victims, but architects of our future, and say, how can we learn from this? What can we say as designers that we can truly learn from this particular experience and say, am I gathering that intelligence to be able to sort of adapt what we're doing towards a better future? That's really the opportunity here. And I'm optimistic about it. And I hope all of you are too. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tim, for bringing light to some important points to consider. I'd like to dive deeper and bring us back to your last 2 points about the operations and invisible indicators, specifically around how COVID has now given us a new opportunity to reflect on what we are designing, what we are building, and how sustainable it is to uphold. I especially enjoyed hearing your point about consequences from the things we make when we pull from the earth. A lot of what we do in design is to build these things and make mistakes, and afterwards go through the process of correcting it. And for example, the idea of recycling and taking waste and reusing it. When we look into the future, we can't really afford to be a reuse culture, but to start thinking about designing systems like those who are designing vaccines for the COVID virus. Vaccines have never been designed for the COVID virus before, so they're starting from scratch. The root of it is that we really have to track and see things earlier in order to see results now. With that being said, almost in everything we build, we're going to have to involve designers. What would be the future role of a designer? Traditionally, we see designers as those drafting paper, literally sketching doodles, logos, fonts, all shapes and sizes, processes. Do we see a designer's new role in the post-COVID world being more backed by science, math, statistics on top of sketching? What is your take on post-COVID design thinking skills that one needs to have to learn in school, and what do designers need to evolve into in order to be relevant for the future?
I think that's such an incredibly great question, because it really is the question is, how are we educating the designers of the future? And in a way, the design that we have now is too much focused on the product. It's not focused on the process. So if you were to say the role of a designer going forward is to bring back the human in the process. Manufacturing, you mentioned manufacturing. Manufacturing has been so disconnected from the way in which people live their lives, and it shouldn't be. It should be like a living organism tied to how we're consuming. You look at the future is relocalizing manufacturing in many ways, micro factories, on-demand manufacturing. But on-demand manufacturing is manufacturing that is much more transparent, and average daily people have a role in understanding how it's impacting them. We don't look at the beginning enough. We think about the end. It's that problem in design where we say that we're gonna make things that people want and love, but we just scale something that is our best guess, and then we wonder why it doesn't work. And I would say like recycling is an example of that. It's sort of, and we're still kind of like selling this idea that we can take all the plastic and whatever and we can turn it into something else. I'm not against that on some ways, but realize when you're doing that, you're teaching people that those existing methods that aren't working are still viable, and they're not, and we need to change them. So it's a real fundamental change in education that needs to happen for designers. Another thing I would say is much more hybrid skills for a designer. The social sciences need to come in. Creativity is absolutely important. The importance for a designer is to say, what can a human being do that a machine can't do? So what is human learning versus machine learning is really what the designer needs to be focusing on. But are they actually doing that? That would be the challenge. And I think that we need to educate to that within our design schools and business schools. We need to be thinking in that way much more.
I mean, I really do agree with that point, because not post-COVID, because we're not out of COVID yet. But now that during COVID, I think we feel a lot of sense of loneliness in every aspect, right? So loneliness in the office, right? You can't really see your colleagues because you probably have staggered working hours, as well as loneliness with like social distancing, right? So when you're not seeing your friends as much, I feel like when you have the new type of design thinking, or designers who do design thinking, who practice it, will have to really be good at the psychology of loneliness, right? And using that as the core purpose of why they design things, not just why people want it, but really how do you even design things that people want that would also rid loneliness as well, and regaining people. Having design plans that regains people's trust, right? Like restaurants, having an open kitchen, using digital menus, being transparent with how they handle food. And then with real estate, in Hong Kong, we have a lot of real estate, and we have a very dense population, and people live in buildings everywhere. And I wonder if real estate developers will have to involve a lot more open space and allow for enough social distancing between all of us in order to sell more apartments, right? So it helps with social life and the healing of mental health if you can design something or some process that will help rid us of really the inner loneliness of what we're feeling now and perhaps in the future, right?
Yes, I mean, there's so much great information in what you just said, and it so touches on, the first step is that we have to understand we're dealing with unknowns. So we're designing to unknowns. There's a wonderful anecdote that I will share with you, talking to somebody who is in the finance world, who has not been in the office, and talking to him about, does he think that virtual work will be the future or not? And his main concern is that I'm very nervous about not being in the office because I can't show my boss what I'm doing and how hard I'm working. And when I look at that, as a designer looks at that problem and says, maybe there's something wrong in the way in which we're measuring your value in terms of your contribution to that company, that we have created structures that if you just change one thing, it sets off all these other kind of psychological factors that make us unhealthy. It shouldn't be loneliness right now. It should be a new connectivity. But the problem is that the way in which we were designing technology really fed loneliness. Loneliness didn't happen with the pandemic. We have, the minister of loneliness in the UK. Loneliness is an epidemic before COVID. So is COVID the virus that makes us aware of other diseases that were in there that we were feeding with our own design? The designer needs to see that. But a designer is also really good at reallocating resources. So I look at kind of cities, and you mentioned about cities. People talk about, I live in New York, and New York is my love. I love New York, and it is the center of the universe for me because it's such a creative story. But why does it work? It works because it didn't work because it was purposefully designed that way. it was that it was rezoned for artists to use to transfer commercial real estate into artist living that gave us a 20, 30-year span that now sells multi-million-dollar apartments, the memory of that creative time in New York, right? So like we have to feed what is people investing in creativity in ways that are far less obvious. It's more ambiguous. I mean, the creative revolution in the 70s and 80s in New York City wasn't clear. It wasn't it wasn't, but you need policy to allow it to happen. So when you're talking about Hong Kong, it's reallocation of that. I mean, Hong Kong has suffered from, people, micro apartments, designing, squeezing, trying to get more and more into smaller spaces. Now suddenly you have real estate that's open. You need a different way of thinking in terms of how to use that. It's not to simply go to something, it's trying to find the people who know what to do with that, right? That isn't a business question. First, it's a creative question, and then it becomes a business question. And it's also a policy question because you need policies that are actually going to enable it. So there's a lot of opportunity in change, I would say.
I think the government has a lot to really reflect on in order to drive this kind of thinking, right? In your presentation, I also enjoyed learning about the point you made in self-operations, how companies or factories suddenly are perhaps faced with demand changes. If a factory was making jeans and suddenly had to adapt to making virus-related products, how adaptable are they and how sustainable had they been running? If they had to suddenly stop operations, if demand of their original product slowed, are they able to adjust quick enough, right? So Tim, could you tell us a bit more about what you see in terms of US companies thinking more long-term and how they build things, make things, and if there are any examples of implementing more sustainable approaches?
Well, in some ways, again, I mean, that's the crux. It's that what we have over the last 50 years is a change in process. It's, we got the assembly line and it was most understood by automobiles, right? So automobiles have really sort of defined how culturally society has worked. But that was a manufacturing process. And we kind of got disconnected from the fact that, I mean, Ford Motor Company is a car company. They're not really a car company, they're a manufacturing company. And so with crisis, we're moving from an industrial era into sort of the post-industrial era. It's much more on ideas on what should be made and how it should be made. So every company, you're not a fashion company, you're not an auto company, you're actually a material production company. So the question is how agile are you in terms of changing that, being able to produce in small, in large, in changing different kinds of material technology opportunities? We get to, if we stay with one method and it's not working, we hit a wall, right? And so the point is to be able to create more adaptable systems. I think in some ways it changes how manufacturing is going to work, that it needs to be more network manufacturing, less large scale, idea of building one thing and building a lot of it. It's a lot of building smaller on demand. If you look at, I think about the fashion industry, I think of companies like Amazon making investments in this area, is that if I know what people will want, and I know, like, you get people more involved in the pattern of a dress than the actual finished product of a dress. Like, you don't buy the finished product that you have too much of. You get them to understand how to buy the pattern of that and be involved in that, and then be able to manufacture it exactly to them locally and deliver it to them, right? So that's a change in idea of thinking. So all companies are in the manufacturing and logistics business. The best companies right now are the ones that understand that and know how to sort of tie together those fundamental core innovation pillars with understanding how culture is changing. Because you can't just sort of build things really well. you also have to know, well, what do people want? And how do they change how the change in what they want is working? You know, people are not predictable. One of the things that will happen with the pandemic, it happens with recessions, is that people say, well, you know, people have less money and so they buy less, and then, oh, well, then they'll start buying it again later. No, they'll buy differently. And the question for all companies, are you paying attention? Are you gaining intelligence during this time to not only change what it is that you make, but how you make it? So the how of that is like, you know, the finished product is as much about the process of that product. And so you should be making investments in the core aspects of your manufacturing process, the sourcing of your product, of your materials. All of those things become much more important right now.
Speaking about these core pillars, I think the purpose of the design of a company and the sustainability strategy of a company is also really important, right? So Tim, could you share with us some of your thoughts on this in the context of designing of companies, design of spending and retail, even designing of a person's future career in terms of, bringing it back to the title of this today's talk about ghost trends. These things existed pre-COVID, and that we were unaware of, but now with the onset of crisis, ghost trends have accelerated and revealed itself as something more obvious points to consider. So could you share a little bit more about that?
I think that, on the topic of sustainability, it's not that companies weren't thinking about sustainability, but they thought they had much more time. I look at I look at a company like H&M, which has a sustainability position and so forth. But a lot of what they actually do, how the consumer interfaces in what the concept of sustainability is marketing. We have to move. The reality is that we need to stop marketing as much and start innovating. Innovation needs to be the core of how we think of goods and services working, a better understanding of people. And so in terms of thinking of going in and working within companies and sort of affecting change, you have to say, those are the kinds of skills that are going to be much more impactful. It's being able to think long-term, but know how to make an investment short-term that you can connect to that long-term. The other part that I would say is very important is realizing how interconnected businesses are with things that aren't directly related to them. So every business is related to the future of cities and the livability of cities. So, but are they really aware of that, or are they working against their own interests by creating what is a future crisis in congestion, cities not functioning in certain ways? So understanding the interconnectedness of things is going to be very, very important.
Thank you. I know the audience has a few questions for you. So we're going to go to the live Q&A, Tim. Okay. So we have a question from Peter Lee. Hi, Tim. Thanks for sharing. Are there any hidden trends exposed by the pandemic that you are surprised to see or find fascinating?
As a trend forecaster, you're kind of you're never surprised. You sort of learn never to be surprised. But one of the things I will say is that I have a lot of, it's great to see that I have a lot of faith in the resiliency of people. And you see the fact that, one of the things about design, and this gets to the core of design, is that design isn't something that is made. It is something that is, it begins to be designed when people start interacting with it. And when you look at what's happened with the pandemic, is you look at how people hacked their own apartments to be able to, one of the things that I noticed was how people used their balconies during the pandemic to be able to connect with other people. They hadn't used those balconies in that way. It's people adapt and change. Those kinds of ways, it's it gives you hope, and you realize the humanity comes out during this time. But the question is, are we paying attention to it? it sort of works well as a story in a news article, and then we kind of move on and we go back to the things that we were doing before. But those are really important signals for us to think about how we continue to make fundamental changes to how we make things, how companies function, because it's watching people and how they adapt to a crisis like this.
We have another question from Leah. How can the general public build up their resilience to combat invisible situations?
Research, research, research. Do your research, care about what is less obvious. I say, like I use this a lot, is that, you know, as researchers, as designers, we need to think much more like epidemiologists. And it's one of the sort of positive aspects of having to, you know, work through a virus like this is that I think everybody's become a little bit of an epidemiologist. We hear about epidemiology every day in the news. Epidemiologists care about looking at smaller signals and smaller patterns that are happening and recognize how important they are. And that you start, if you pay attention to those things, but then know how to make investments. Work and have a company culture that you can say, that's something that we can begin to invest in. And you can start building a market that will be the post-COVID market, which there will be. And those that are much more forward-thinking will be much more ahead, as opposed to the ones that are kind of treading water and hoping things go back to the way they were. They won't. So thinking creatively is going to be very important, and paying attention to the signals that are emerging. People's behavior is beginning to change. It changes. That's why, I mean, I talk about language a lot. Look at that language. That language is the indicator. It's telling us, before you could ask somebody what they say the next year will be, they're telling you in the way in which they use words to describe things that are important to them. And that's going to be the framework for your brands that you have, you know, for the next 2 to 5 years.
We have time for one last question from Fred. He'd like to know, what are your thoughts on home, since it plays a huge part in many people's lives? Everyone's stuck at home, connecting with others virtually. How do you see the trends of this little space of our own? How do you think it would evolve coming out of the pandemic?
Home, what a brilliant question, because it's the thing that is going to change the most. It's what we think we understand because we live in them, but they're under so much transformation. The fact of the matter is we're stuck in our homes, but we're connecting out of our homes. So you think of things like telework, telehealth, all of these things. Our living rooms, our bathrooms, our bedrooms are becoming health spaces. They're becoming connected to our doctors and into our self-management of our health. The question is, and technology is certainly there to help in doing that. The question is how to make that truly healthy. You know, it's not simply that the technology can track things and then everything is okay. We can create a problem there if we're not careful. But the thing is that be aware of how we can make our homes much more healthy. Tying our kitchens to our health. I think the trend in kitchens is amazing, because I see, like, there's a couple of trends. Kitchens, we see what we eat as being so much more tied to our management of our own health. I see our bedrooms, we see our sleep tied so much more to the management of our health and our brain health. We're going to live longer. We're living into our 80s and 90s. And if we live into our 80s and 90s, we need healthy brains. We have healthy brains if we sleep well. So how well are we managing that? Those are the kinds of issues in terms of how we design our homes. We used to design them to look a certain way. Now we have to have them function in a certain way, but to the benefit of the people who live in them. That's going to be very important.
It has been such a pleasure having you, Tim, tune in live from New York, and our audience in Asia for staying up. I hope that we were able to get through as many questions as we could have. From all of us at KODW 2020, thank you for tuning in. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you all.